Okay, guys, let's get started. So we are very pleased to have John Van Reenen giving the second keynote at this conference. John, the floor is yours. You have an hour.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me and for the organisers to put me on the last session on the last thing on Friday, where I'm the only thing keeping you from the pub. So I thought...
It's only past 3, the pub. I mean, can wait an hour.
Late to go to the pub. So I thought about, for this, I could present a single paper and loads of equations and maths. I thought probably at this time, at the end of the conference, it might be better for the keynote to give an overview of a particular area that I've been working on, many other people working on, to kind of give you a kind of sense about what I think is one of the most important things in economics, let alone labour economics, which is thinking about inequalities between firms, dispersion. So as labour economists, we think a lot about inequality between people and places and communities and households. But I'm going to argue that to understand that many of those things, you need to think about inequalities or differences between firms. And I'm going to talk a bit about those and why I think it's important to kind of think about inequalities between firms and also understand inequalities. The labour markets in general, but inequalities between people in particular. So it draws on several papers and several co-authors, particularly this paper that I've been involved with, ongoing work with Jan below here and Tim Obermeyer, thinking about firms and inequality. So, part of what inspired me to get interested in giving this talk was that at the beginning of this year in Forbes, there was a headline that said that Apple has become the first company in the world to be worth $3 trillion in market value. And that was quite surprising for some of us and a bit depressing for some of us as well. Because that was greater than is greater than the GDP of the United Kingdom, which caused some surprise in some quarters. But of course, Apple is not the only very large, very valuable company in the world. These are the so-called GAFAMs: Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. So you can see that this is the beginning of the year market value. Microsoft $2.5 trillion, Google just under $2 trillion, Amazon 1.7 trillion, Facebook 1 trillion. So, these are, I like the word GAFA because, GAFA, British slang, GAFA is the boss, right? GAFA is the boss, is the boss companies. So the boss companies are really large. They're very bossy, very powerful. Now, of course, this was kind of partly supercharged by COVID as everything shifted online, both in terms of our consumer behaviour and our work behaviour. But the growth of these superstar mega firms actually has been going on for a lot before the pandemic, as I'm going to show you. And it's actually been going on not just in the kind of digital space, but also in lots of parts of the less high-tech parts of the economy. It's a much more general phenomenon, as I will show you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about lots of vast heterogeneity across firms in terms of their size, productivity, wages, management, and cross-section. This may be well known, but what's less well known and goes back to what I just showed you, is that these differences across firms are getting larger over time as these superstar firms pull away from the rest. Why does this matter? Partly it matters in terms of if these phenomena are affecting aggregate productivity, and aggregate productivity determines aggregate wages, then there's a direct effect on the things we care about in terms of aggregate wages. But it also matters in terms of thinking about inequality. One, partly because of between workers, because as many of the papers presented at the conference have shown, firm effects are important in wage determination. I'll talk about those. But it also matters in terms of thinking about allocation between labour and capital, as I'll show you. The growth of superstar firms is important in terms of thinking of the decline of the share of labour, which has happened in many countries. And the final part will say, well, why is this happening? What's the underlying causes? I'm going to argue that many of these changes are fundamentally technological rather than institutional. But that doesn't mean that there's no policy implications. So I'm going to draw out some of the policy implications at the end, particularly around competition antitrust policy, but also amongst labour market policy, depending on how we go on time. See how far we get. Okay, so let's start off with talking about the cross-section. This is maybe more well known. So often when I'm teaching the grad course that Guy and Steve and other people teach on here. I started to say it's not new. Firm heterogeneity has long been recognised. There's quotes on the kind of dispersion of, in this case, firm performance in terms of profits. Some firms very profitable, some less profitable. And this is from the QJ in '87. Of course, the students look at me. Professor Van Reenen, you're so old. This is from 1987, when the dinosaurs roamed the earth. We never read things that far back, even QJ. But of course, this is from the 1887 QJ, the first volume of the QJ, when Francis Walker wrote about this. Actually, apart from being the president of MIT and the founder of the American Economic Association, he's also in charge of the US Census collection, economic census collections. It's a census box or something. So his statement came out, part of that looking at firms. But it's only been in the recent decades when we can actually more systematically look at this. We'll see the same thing. So there's been this explosion of microdata over the last few decades, which has kind of confirmed this idea of massive firm heterogeneity in terms of firm size, management, productivity, profits, and exports. Apart from Walker, Givrat, him of the law, that you may know, one of his, in 1932, in the Economics of Inequality, he actually described the cross-sectional distribution of firm size. That's one place to begin with. So this is the US this is the US size distribution of firm size in a log scale. This is just the number of firms for different sizes, from 1 up to 10 up to 100 and so on. And you can see this, well-known power law of firm size. You have many firms that are very small here, and a few firms who are extremely large. And in fact, the power law, it's almost like it's very close to Zipf's law, the slope of 1, which can be used in different contexts for thinking about the effects of things like regulation of firm size. So if you look at what that means, this is some 2019 data from the latest available US data, but let's define mega firms as firms which have more than 5,000 workers. For firms who have more than 5,000 workers, there's about 2,700 of those. They're kind of 0.05% of the population of firms, but they account for like 35% of all employees. So 35% of employees work in a relatively few number of firms, which account for a very large fraction of jobs. So firm size, big dispersion. Of course, I have to, every presentation I have to put up management, it's kind of on my job description. I have to put up something with the word of management practices. This just shows you the variation of management practices as measured by the World Management Survey team. This is about 25,000 firms across 39 countries in the world. And you can see in every country there's very wide variation of the kind of quality of management. These are extremely well-managed firms, these are very badly managed firms. The badly managed firms are not doing, not tracking what goes on inside their firms. They have very little targets, and have very little policies about hiring and firing and promoting people based on merit. Although, say, the US is a much higher score than India, there's massive variation wherever you look. So just as Francis Walker speculated, big differences in management and big differences in productivity. So Chad Syverson's JL survey, for example, shows in the US, if you compared the top 10%, bottom 10% of firms, in terms of labour productivity output per worker, the ratio within a typical narrowly defined 4-digit industry, so like synthetic cement, is a factor of about 4 to 1 between the P19 and the P10. If you take out other things to do with capital intensity and so on, the TFP ratio is still a factor of about 2 to 1. So in a very narrowly defined industry, big dispersion of productivity. And if you look outside the US and other countries, this dispersion typically is even wider, especially in developing countries. So, as I said, this has now been replicated in many other countries. Some high quality kind of census type of databases, and you see a lot of variation in productivity. Okay, this may not be very interesting if these are just transitory differences. So these differences in productivity went away very quickly. And there is turnover. There is a process of creative destruction where the well-managed firms, the more productive firms, tend to grow and expand, and the least productive tend to shrink and exit. But this doesn't happen immediately. There's lots of persistent differences in productivity. So, for example, about 2/3 of all establishments, the top TFP quintile, are still there 5 years later. And although competition works, there is this creative destruction process. It takes a while for this to occur. So competition works for kind of at a distance. So this idea of these persistent performance differentials, as Bob Gibbons, who's visiting at the moment, tells us, it's always been fundamental to industrial organization and to organizational economics. But now it's increasingly somewhat recognized in trade and Mellett's model, macro, like Sharon Keynote, and increasingly in microeconomics. So it's interesting, but do we care about it in some levels? So I'd say, politicians, of course, obsessed with firm size, all these policies to help out small and medium-sized enterprises. And when you ask, when you think about why that happens, it's not obvious why you should give lots of tax breaks or help to small firms. The small firms are not the same as poor families or poor communities. So giving, from a welfare point of view, it's obvious why we should care about small firms and inequality first. But it says at least 4 reasons why we might care. One is a political economy reason. So we may care about the size of firms, kind of Brandeisian view, which is very popular in the Biden administration right now, because large firms are able to capture the political process as a kind of lobbying concern. So I won't talk much about this, but I think that is something which we should all be thinking about. On the more conventional labor economics, or economic point of view, inequality matters because it matters for aggregate productivity and therefore aggregate wages. So I mentioned this creative destruction process, the way that there's a reallocation going on all the time in market economies, away from the less productive towards the more productive firms. This is a force for increasing aggregate productivity and also therefore a force for raising productivity, so, and therefore wages and income. So this is positive elements about firm inequality. But of course, there can be negative things. So if the firm size distribution, if say the superstar firms are pulling away from other firms because it's becoming harder for those second-tier firms to catch up because there's more barriers to the diffusion of technology or management practices, then this is a force for lowering productivity. So the differences of firm size very much depends on what the underlying causes are for the changes in the firm size distribution. So I'll come back to that when I think about policy. A third reason, and this is something which I will also talk about, is that one of the things about these very large firms, the superstar firms, like the Googles, the Apples, the Microsofts, this is a more general phenomenon, is that they tend to have much lower labor shares of sales and value added. And that's the flip side, in a way, of them having higher price cost margins. So they have higher profits, higher price markups. This means that these very large firms often tend to have very low labor shares. So if the environment is shifting towards these larger firms and they have these low labor shares, that means there will be the reallocation effect is going to be shifting downwards the overall labor share economy. And we're going to show you some of that this actually does matter, and it is one of the forces for keeping labor share down. Certainly important in the US. And I'll talk about what the results are like in the UK as well. And of course, why do we care about the split between labour and capital? This is a Marxist kind of concern we don't care about anymore. Well, we might care about that because most of people's income is actually from the labour market earnings. So if the labour share is falling, that's also going to be a force for overall inequality between different households. And then finally, of course, this is where many of the papers which we've heard presented today and before. A fourth reason why firm inequality matters is that where you work matters for your wages and, of course, for your well-being. So increased inequality between firms is going to be an upward pressure on overall pay inequality between individuals. So let's talk about the fourth one. That's come up in some other of the papers today. As you know, even holding worker characteristics constant, firms seem to have this influence of wages. And there's 2 broad ways in the literature that we look at this. One is the AKM approach, which we've talked about before, 2-way fixed effect models, like the one that Alan and Nina were using. And the second kind of approach in the literature is we call it a rent sharing approach, which is where we trace the impact of an observable firm performance shock on wages, typically of incumbent wages, if we can. And what are the examples of such shocks? Well, I have a personal prejudice towards liking technology shocks, going back to again the age of the dinosaurs. When I was a graduate student writing my journal market paper, and showing that technological innovations seem to raise rents in firms, and some of those were shared with workers. And of course, with much better data, Pat Klein and co-authors in a much more recent paper have shown you also see the same kind of thing, that high-value patterns seem to increase the rents that firms have, and that also gets shared with workers by wages. But other shocks you could think about are trade shocks, export shocks, so on. So typically, these kind of approaches have suggested that there are important effects of firms on wages. I think, there's still a question about what model to rationalize these effects. This is, I think, an empirical set of empirical results. Exactly what the firm effects are, or the rent sharing effects are, what models explain those, is still something which is the subject of a lot of debate. So when we first started doing this, we went back to my paper about in the newspaper, we thought of this as a kind of collective bargaining situation, a rent sharing model of unions. So unions could get a share of the rents. In the individual type of bargaining model, of search and matching frameworks, again, it's a bargaining over the rents. But the more recent literature, very much like what Alan was presenting his paper this morning, has a kind of wage posting type of setup, either based on dynamic monopsony, as Alan was describing, or actually much more commonly now based on the kind of Carter-Tau approach, which is actually is a more static approach, static monopsony approach, drawn from the IO literature. It's actually a version of Berry, Levis, and Paikey to the IO literature. And so I'll talk a little bit about one of the most recent papers just to illustrate that. So this is quite like this lambda monopsony, the Seltzer paper, which has come out in the AR. Actually pulls, it's a wage posting model that pulls both of those elements together. So it has an AKM model and rent sharing in a general static wage posting and monopsony model. So we have workers with heterogeneous quality, of course. We have firms with heterogeneous productivity, which I've said is important, both at entry and at merits, but also these firms are subject to ongoing idiosyncratic shocks over time. So in their model, these are kind of market, these are kind of firm and market level value-added shocks. And then the key element is, from the Carter-Tau approach, is we have these firm amenities, job flexibility, commuting distances, the kind of unobserved benefits of firms, but are valued heterogeneously amongst different individuals. So what that means, it generates this kind of upward sloping supply curve for labour, which is what we do. So in that kind of setup, what it means is when a firm gets a productivity shock, this gets translated through to workers' wages. Why? Because there's wage posting models. The firm wants to grow, and in order to grow, it needs to attract more workers, and to attract more workers, it needs to increase wages because it faces like a certain supply curve. So this is the mechanism through which shocks get translated into wages through the lens of monopsony. So what this means is the firm size distribution partially is going to determine the wage distribution. So in the laminar cell setup, what that means is you get the kind of log wages of the individual I in firm J at time T being a function of these four characteristics plus measurement error, if you like. So there's the standard kind of worker quality effect. You get a time invariant firm average effect, which is the kind of classical AKM effect. You get a time varying firm shock effect, which is the kind of pass-through coefficient and shocks to firms and workers. So that's like the traditional rent sharing things like the inflation approach. And then in addition to that, you get a sourcing effect where you can get an effect where workers of higher quality can go to firms of higher productivity. So those four terms are all going to be to determine the underlying distribution of wages. And in their kind of paper, these IRS employee data for about 15 years, they use a mixture of internal instruments. So that's using assumptions over the TFP process. And I think more attractively in some of the work, external instruments such as procurement auctions. So firms involved in government procurement auctions get some shocks, that's the demand shock, which increases your rents, or basket approaches in order to identify the effects of those first two firm effect terms in the first equation there. They try to tackle some of the limited mobility bias. So as many of you know, one of the things which has come out of problems of recent AKM models is that when you don't have sufficient mobility between firms, you can really get a wrong estimate of the firm effect. And I don't think, so there's various potential solutions to this. None of those are completely resolved yet, but one method is kind of K-means clustering method that one always had, which is to basically group the firm effects into different groups. And there's some evidence that can help get better estimates of what the firm effects are, as well as using the usual kind of diagnostics to try and deal with what these work almost too well. It almost seems like conditional on the permanent heterogeneity. There doesn't seem to be a lot of exogeneity. That seems to come out of most of the kind of papers in this area. So that's one example. The bottom line, I'd say, from not just this paper, from the number of different papers now, is that although in the cross section, worker quality effects tend to dominate, firm effects matter, both in the kind of raw firm AKM effects and the rent sharing effects, but also importantly during sourcing. Especially when you try and deal with some of the limited mobility bias, you typically find good workers are sorted into good firms. And that's another important element of how to think about what's happening with wages. So I'd say that if I look at the literature overall, there's a lot of evidence on the importance of firms in the cross section. They're less important than the usual firm heterogeneity, but they remain very important. I said there's a lot less certainty about where these effects are coming from, especially the permanent components. How important is different technology, management, niches of demand. The way I like to think of this, and I think this is an area where there could be a lot more work, is that firms are like bundles of capabilities. They're combinations of different capabilities of workers, of managers, of technologies. And there's in the organization like this is one of the reasons why these benefits of business is actually quite surprisingly hard to replicate the high productivity of other firms. Knowing exactly what element it is, which makes a firm successful, is not easy. I mean, if you think about the diffusion of technology, often it's unusually slow in management practices. And part of that is just the difficulty of diffusion of replicating a successful firm. And you might say, well, why don't the unsuccessful firms just get driven out of the market very quickly? I think for that, you have to think about the fact there are real frictions in product markets. So competition works, but there's a lot of imperfect competition in product markets, which means that even less productive firms can hang on in the market for a long time. We see this over and over again. Competition is a very effective way of increasing productivity, but it's not a magic bullet. It doesn't completely get rid of all the unproductive firms very quickly. Okay, so that's the kind of overview of the cross-section. Probably a lot of you knew that quite well already. What I want to now turn to is what's happened over time in the time series, which I think is less well known and perhaps even more interesting. So, okay, so if you wanted to say what's happened to big firms as labor economists, what's the first thing you do? Well, you say, let's take the table I showed you at the beginning. What fraction of jobs are in big firms? And let's just look at how that's changed over time. So this is taking, again, you could do this in different parts of the distribution. This is the one which is easiest if it's consistent with the US Census. And these are firms with more than 5,000 workers, and just saying what fraction of people, of workers are working in those firms. So you can see from this is the number I showed you before in 2019, 35% of all US workers, US employees, I should say, were in these kind of mega firms, superstar firms. If you went back to the mid-80s, this is more like kind of 28%. So there's been a kind of very significant increase in the fraction of workers working in big firms over this time period, which is the most simple thing straight out of the box. Now, one issue with doing that is that jobs or employees are not necessarily the best measure of firm size. If you think about some of the firms I started with, Google or Microsoft or Facebook, I remember when I was living in San Francisco, I went down to Mountain View HQ of Google, and I was really surprised kind of how few workers there were, even in the headquarters of Google. And the reason, I think one of the reasons for that is that many of these very large firms have what my former colleague Eric Bryn-Johnson at MIT said is scale without mass. In other words, their kind of footprint in terms of their sales is way bigger than the number of workers they employ. Say a comparison would be like a car manufacturing firm, a lot of workers on the sales, but for many of these other kind of digital firms, they have a lot more sales than you expect given the workforce. So looking at, say, revenues or some other measure of scale might be better. This is what we did in the kind of QJ paper with David Alter, David Norman, Larry Katz, and Christina Patterson. We compared sales. This is concentration, so this is relative to the industry average. So this is the US census, so it's kind of just about every firm in the US economy. And we constructed a kind of measure of industry at the 4-digit level and looked at various measures of concentration, these are kind of 4-firm and 8-firm concentration measures. So like in the manufacturing sector, for example, there are about 600 different industries, and this is the average concentration over time of the top 4, top 20 firms in those industries. And what you can see, whichever segment you look at, retail, sales, service, and so on, big increases of kind of concentration of the large firms, whether it's manufacturing or retail or wholesale. You see that, you know, if you measure this just by employment, you kind of in many sectors underestimate the importance of concentration. And if you think, you know, a lot of the high-tech firms will be in the service sector, but you can see these increases of concentration happening all over. So, you know, we always thought this was true in finance with big banks, but you also see this in retail. So what's happening in retail? Well, it's firms like Walmart, Costco becoming increasingly dominant. So, you know, sales concentration, big increases happening at this time in the US. Is it just happening in the US? Well, there's more controversy about what's happening in the rest of the world in terms of data. It's harder to get such consistent data. The best data I've seen is by the OECD. This is the multi-product project by Chiara Casciullo and others, where, you know, the underlying data is the economic census, so it's the population of all firms. So what you really want to do is do the same in every other country. So what if I think 9 or so European countries here, they can do this broadly the same thing using the administrative microdata, calculating concentration measures, and, you know, this is one measure. This is the share of output in the top 10% of all firms, and at least over the kind of period since 2000, we've seen here that also appears to be increasing the concentration happening. You know, there's an argument about whether it's big or not in the US. I think it's a kind of smaller increase in the US. There's a lively debate between other people who's got a data source. But I think using the best quality data, which the OECD team have done, there does appear to be this increase of sales concentration in the US, like that's big in Europe, like that's big in the US. Now, you know, as I know, I think someone had to burn my IO card at some point because I like doing cross industry work. But you know, I still have a card carrying IO membership, so you know, you also have to say industrial concentration is not the same as market power. You know, don't get confused. There's lots of reasons why an increase in concentration has nothing to do with increase in market power. So, you know, I've used 4-digit industries that might be way too wide. You know, in the US or in other countries, you want to use much narrower markets. You know, you want to, these don't take imports fully into account. So there's lots of reasons why concentration may be a poor measure of market power. So an alternative, a more attractive alternative, is to look directly at price cost margin. So there, you don't have to define exactly what the market is. You can try and look at what the wedge is between price and in this case, variable costs. Now, of course, that's not easy to do. You know, measuring marginal costs is not easy. I won't spend the whole lecture going on different ways of doing this. Here is one way that people have tried to do this. This is a paper by Jan Lokia, Jan Eekhouse, and Gabriel Unger and QJ. This is using a kind of a production function approach to get the output elasticity variable factor relative to the share of that variable factor. And if you look at what's happened, at least in their measure of hundreds of US firms, you can see that over the same period I showed you concentration increases, a very significant increase in the price cost markup from about 20% to 60%. So markups of firms on the product market with this type of measure seem to be going up. You know, one of the issues is that their study is just publicly listed US firms, and 2/3 of all workers in the US work in non-publicly listed firms. So you might say this is a pretty biased sample, which it is. It's the biggest firms, but you know, it might be misleading. So we've kind of replicated that. It's not in a QJ paper. We've kind of replicated this using census data on all firms, and you know, the picture looks pretty similar. I mean, not quite as large at the beginning, but a pretty similar, consistent increase in markups over time. The interesting thing as well, and this comes out of also their work, if you look at public listed firms, this is really driven by not the median firm or the average firm, but it's the weighted market, where the weight is the relative size of the firm. And what this is saying is that the increase of markup is being driven by what's happening at the top of the distribution. And the primary force of this is the way in which more and more output is moving towards the high markup firms. They're getting a bigger and bigger share of the economy. And that reallocation force is telling them to rise the markup. Now, there's also the fact that they're getting higher markups, even though they're big firms. That's also going on here. But the primary forces is kind of between that going.
How much of that is kind of industry? I mean, if you control for industries, how much?
So this I've just shown you is for manufacturing, but you can recognize that's where the data is the best. But you can reweight this by looking at the industry. There's a component of the industry mix, but at least in the markup stuff, it's not the major component. It seems to be happening across a number of industry. There is a lot of industry heterogeneity, don't get me wrong, but the general increase is actually in a lot of industries, not just in of course, there is variation, but high-tech industries is going up more in other sectors, but there is this is a more general point. Okay. Yeah, sure.
I would have split it out by sales and total costs. Cost is declining.
So that again.
If the aggregate markup is being driven by lower average costs rather than higher sales prices, that would put the inference different.
Oh no, absolutely. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And this is an issue because separating out what is due to higher prices versus lower costs is actually, you get a ratio you can estimate, but separating out those two elements is much harder. So I'll talk a bit about this. I mean, I think my take on what's going on is both of those are going on. So many of these, think of them in the broader sense, these more successful firms are having lower quality adjusted marginal costs, but are also earning higher markups than some of those. But that is one of the hardest things, because separating those out well differentially is much harder than measuring composite. Because as you can imagine, these prices are difficult to measure. But we'll see some evidence on that coming up later. But that's really, and it's really important thinking about the welfare implications as well. I mean, if it was all, one view is it's all prices going up, and costs could be going up rather than down, and that's the worst possible situation, if you like. The other is it's just costs going down and prices staying the same, and prices going down more slowly than costs. That's a pretty good situation. I think the reality is it's a kind of mixture of both. Okay, and this is what's happening in other countries. So Europe, there's some differences in parts of the world. We're called yan type of analysis data. We see this happening in Europe as well as the US. So that's markups. Here's productivity dispersion again from the LSE data. And so you also see this kind of increase in differences between firms in terms of productivity dispersion. I thought I had one from the US. This is the UK. So I just, these are repeated cross sections. So this is just normalizing the 2000 and saying, if you look at the dispersion across, this is in terms of 90-10 log productivity, dispersion between firms going up, but you see it productivity. This hasn't got the UK in it. So one of the things we wanted to do is to look at the UK data. So if you look at the UK data, this is a rather depressing picture actually. So this is basically from what's called the Historical August database, which is an attempt, I'm seeing Andreas at the back here, who knows this very well. It's an attempt to get the digitized records of every firm in the world. And this is the kind of UK part of this. This is what's happened this is value added per worker. We've weighted by firms, weighted by number of workers, so it's half rank all productivities, workers above, so workers below. You can see that in the years leading up to the global financial crisis, there's reasonably healthy growth of productivity. Then there was a collapse during the financial crisis, a recovery, and it's been pretty flat ever since. Now, that's just the median firm. If you look at aggregate productivity in the UK, it looks very much like this. So, number one, to my mind, biggest problem in the UK economy is this slow productivity growth. So that's bad news, and it's come back to what Zoe just said, that's going to worry about the overall picture. But in terms of what's happened in terms of dispersion, what's really quite interesting is that if you look at the top 10% of firms, or employment-weighted top 10% of workers in the top most productive firms, you can see that there's been a pretty big increase in productivity. That's about 40 log points. Whereas in the least productive firms, there's actually been somewhat. So these are repeated cross sections, remember? So this is just showing you that the overall distribution between firms is getting wider and wider in terms of productivity. So increasing differences between firms. Here's my US one. Here's my US one using AHD data from 1997. This is using the standard deviation of between firm productivity. This is productivity on this line, and this is wages on this line, and they're going up kind of in tandem together. So between firm wages and between firm productivity seems to be increasingly different over time. And this is the UK picture over the 1996 to 2016 period for average wages by firm. Not as big a dispersion increase of average productivity, the scaling is less, but still big increase in the dispersion of wages, average wages for most firms. So, pretty interesting. Now, all of that is just taking firm averages. And you might say, well, what's happening within firms? And that is a much harder question to answer in many of the data sets. Like the UK data, we don't have the data to do that. In the US data, some parts of the US data, we can say something about this. So this is taken from the Song et al. Paper using the Social Security Administration data set. And this is quite a useful graph to have. So what this is doing is looking between the 1991 and 2013 period. This is all individuals, basically, in the US. And then it's lining up the percentile distributions along the x-axis, and then looking what's happened over the next kind of 30 years. So this blue line is what's happening for individual earnings, and this is just as we all know, over this period, the kind of high wage workers were getting high wages, and the low wage workers were getting nothing. This red line is what's happening using just average earnings by firm, like the other things I've shown you before. And again, it's just showing you it's another way of describing the firm size distribution. So the high wage firms are paying high wages, the low wage firms are not. This green line is what's happening within firms. So the individual data, you look at the relative wages within firms at different points of the kind of distribution. So you can see there's some evidence that within firm inequality is increasing. At the very top, look at this CEOs, that the CEO versus the average worker within firms increase. But really, the vast majority of this inequality increase has been driven by what's happening between firms rather than firms. It's kind of interesting. Given a lot of the emphasis on what's happening within firms and relative wages within firms, really the big picture differences happening in terms of inequality is what's happening between firms. So, in the cross section, that's true.
No, but in terms of the change.
Well, according to the song, the numbers have changed in the different versions of the paper. I think the final version was like 3/4 between firm and 1/4. That's my recollection.
But I remember designations wasn't it like putting all the firms with effect?
There is some, but at least, and this is the, we could get into, is the problems in the SSA data, we don't have hours, maybe bias because you love the hours. I think the signal in lots of this, where this has come out of other, there's actually two other papers you can purpose to. So the lambda et al. Paper does it for the IRS data, which is a shorter time period. And there's also a new paper by John Holzbach, using the AHD, and all three of them come to the same broad conclusion that the between firm element is the dominant element. There's some within firm changes, but it's much less than between firm changes. But the question is, what is what is the between firm change? So here's, recall what I showed you up earlier, as I the ladders out paper. You can kind of think about dividing up where these wage effects come from. So, you can implement a kind of ACAM style decomposition, and then you can decompose the changes of those between firm effects into different components. So there's actually, you do this in more places, there's at least 3 different components. So one component is, so imagine you do your ACAM, let's do the ACAM effect, your firm effect, and the worker effect. One effect is kind of segregation. So, every individual gets has their individual effect. Part of the between firm effect could be coming from an increasing amount of high wage individuals working with other high wage individuals and low wage individuals working with other low wage individuals. Think of this as the McKinsey-McDonald's economy. So more and more people like McKinsey, everybody gets a lot of money, and more people like McDonald's, everybody gets low amounts of money. And really that difference is just due to the individual effects. So that's the kind of the first segregation, called the literature segregation effect. The second one is a kind of sorting effect, and that's the covariance between individuals' quality and workers' quality. That's a kind of sorting of good workers to good firms. And the third one is a kind of pure firm effect. As firms, the firm effect of the ACAM model is becoming increasingly dispersed. So there's controversy over exactly how those different components of the between firm distribution separate out. So I think the general consensus of this is moving literature of those 3 papers I mentioned on the US data is that the segregation effect is the dominant effect. So most of this increase of the between firm distribution is because increasingly high-skilled workers are working together and low-skilled workers, and not just on the observables and non-observables. So that's one important type of effect. The other two effects also matter, but they matter less than segregation effects. And there's also difference between different countries. I think in David's paper, the kind of CHK paper on the German data that Alan was using, there's a much bigger role for kind of pure firm effects, if you like, than so I think, we could spend a lot of time talking about, one is, of course, we might worry about how the ACAM composition works, not obvious given some of these mobility advantages of the composition. Even if you thought segregation is the main thing, why is it the economy has become increasingly segregated? I think that's very much an open, interesting question. And whatever way you think about it, these 2 other effects, the pure firm effect and sort of effects, seem to also maybe not important segregation. Yeah.
So using the term segregation, so has anybody done this across the space and dot side? Yeah. How much of this inequality is across location? How much geography matters?
Ooh, that's an interesting question.
In the UK, probably.
Yeah, I mean, if you thought every firm was in a different space, you could maybe do that. Of course, most firms are not. Mostly superstar firms are all over the, they kind of think about, Google that's operating in many different places. So you'd have to look within units across.
Google doesn't
No. Yeah, I mean, I know that, from the management data, for example, that we did in the AR paper where we did this, there is a lot of variation within firms across different plants. Now, how much of that is different locations? I mean, there is some superstar cities, and those are making impact. I mean, Henry Overman says that the different, like in the UK, for example, the growth of the space has been vastly exaggerated in the literature. But so I will ponder that question. I think it's a good question, and that's certainly something we'll do. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
If what was happening was workers became more equally with the firm, as workers have an higher covariance, I understand a lot of this is based on wages as a way of inferring quality.
Well, this picks up this principle, picking up the differences across workers within the firm. If what's happening is that there's increased sorting, that's actually a force for compressing differentials within firms.
Yes, I'm asking about the segregation.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, so I understand how sorting works more or less. But at segregation, I'm not quite sure what underlying reach parameters are helping identify. So I was just asking you, if for whatever reason, if it's such a covariance between the workers, it's two people working more similarly today, but might not have been previously, like different firms and different effects.
Could be, yeah. I mean, they could certainly be moving across different firms for sure. I mean, I think one part of the story might be outsourcing. So, you know, going back to my Google example, if you go in the Google Mountain, people wear different badges as the kind of Google employees and the outsourced employees. So you can certainly, part of the phenomena here, maybe all of this, we don't know because we haven't got really good outsourcing data as far as I know anywhere in the world, but if we did, this would be great, is that, you know, it could be, the extreme case is that on the site, it's the same workers, but now all the caterers and security guards and truckers are now employed by Sodexo and G4 and outsourcing specialist companies. And the core workers or the high skilled workers are all being paid similar workers. That could be part of what's happening here. I don't think anybody really knows that, and there's a little bit of evidence here and there, but that I think would be a really interesting thing to look at. And it could be what's going on here. It could be not just the, you know, it could be a different effective moving of people across different firms, even if they're in the same location. Of course, it could be different locations. Okay, let me push on a little bit because I want to talk about some of the explanations of what's going on. Okay, so one of the stories about why firms are becoming increasingly different, what's the growth of superstar firms? At least 4 stories. One is the kind of Google or Apple story, which is really a story about kind of platform competition. So, you know, where network effects are very important, you know, think about Google search, they have a better algorithm, more people use it, more people start shifting towards it, more advertisers go to it, tips the market to Google. That's a kind of network effect story which leads to, winner take all type of phenomena in some markets. So that's one thing. A second thing, and again, I think this is clearly part of what's happening, but I don't think it's the whole story which is happening, because you see this increased concentration happening in many different industries. So one of the stories I call the Walmart story is that if there's been a big growth of important intangible capital, especially around software, and large firms have increased costs, large firms are better at exploiting those. Now, why Walmart? Well, one of the reasons for Walmart's success is that they're able to invest massively in software to manage their distribution systems and just-in-time inventory management. You know, you can't imagine a mom-and-pop store or a small independent retailer doing that. So the growth of the importance of ICT and software or other forms of intangible capital may have meant that large firms now have a much bigger advantage than they used to before, and some evidence of that. That's kind of the development of technology, that's the use of technology. A third story is a kind of falling competition story, going back to, you know, as I was saying, that, you know, one story is that antitrust enforcement has got worse. We're allowing too many mega mergers, too much anti-competitive behavior, and that's enabled these larger firms to exploit their market power, and that's why they're becoming more powerful. But Philip Wall in his book emphasizes this argument. And there could also be the opposite argument, that globalization may also have, you know, by lowering communication costs and trade liberalization, reallocates more market share towards successful firms. This could also cause a shift towards the larger firms. And you might say, well, how is that consistent with markups going up? Because, you know, more globalization competition shrink markups. That's true. But if the reallocation effect is big enough, you know, that goes in the opposite direction, and that can actually mean you can actually get increased in markups as well. So these are kind of 4 broad stories. There's a whole industry and macro, including, you know, our own Philip Aghion and Martin Derrida, trying to put these together and try to, you know, understand what's happening. Again, I think this is an open area. My personal sense, I think that there's not a kind of one. I think there's probably different things happening in different industries. So my personal sense is that, you know, there are certainly industries where falling competition is happening, it's firms capturing things. I think there's also certainly industries where you have these network effects in the markets, and there's a large number of industries where this is true. So, you know, I actually think a more disaggregated approach might be the way to kind of understand which of these is more dominant. But that, you know, I run this mega firms conference every year with Chad Syverson, And so, we've done this for 3 years, we still haven't got consensus on what is happening. But there's certainly lots of different.
Sorry, John, can I ask, those 4 explanations,
Yeah.
are they mostly related to the AKM firm level component of inequality rather than segregation? You would have, I mean, from the way you've described them, right?
Well, you could have both going on. Say everything was segregation, you could still have these things happening, but it wouldn't necessarily help explain wage inequality. It would certainly be something an important thing happening.
For example, if you have the technological story, and then these firms can pay higher wages because they have a higher AKM component, then they attract more workers,
yeah.
So they become bigger and bigger. And yeah, it doesn't have to work with segregation, because it doesn't have to be the workers with the high individual level AKM component that are attracted, are they?
No, I think the natural way to think about it is, I mean, what I would like to think about it is it is working more through the kind of firm effects,
right,
certain components. And, of course, I like the innovation element of it, creating rents, as rents getting shared with workers in various ways. So that would be my preferred explanation. But of course it may not be like that. These things could be going on, but it could all just be individual workers and these firms that contain those workers. So you'd have to say, why is it that, why has this segregation changed? What's happening to technology? Right. So you could tell some people have those type of models that try and fit those together. It's like kind of winner take all in the product market and winner take all in the labour market. Okay. Just as a broad sense of assessing this, is the rise of superstar firms good or bad? So these superstar firms are more productive, so some reallocations will increase productivity. But superstar firms are not classical monopolists. So if you look at, say, the industries where you've got the biggest increase of concentration, these also tend to be the industries where you see higher growth of CEP, higher growth of productivity, higher growth of patenting and other measures of innovation. So it's, these are not the kind of typical slow-growing, less productive industries. These are the more, as we'd imagine, the more dynamic industries. And it's also the case that there's evidence for spillover. So, for example, there's this recent work that I've been doing looking at the spillover impacts of superstar firms. So looking at firms, like firms who form relationships with superstar firms, you see, like from the event study, after you form a relationship with superstar firms, kind of spillover productivity effects onto other firms who start these relationships. So this is an example from multinationals, but you can see this actually for any superstar firm with these kind of spillover benefits. So there are lots of benefits to superstar firms, but there are also these costs. So, if these firms have the ability to exercise market power, you can imagine that these negative effects on in terms of prices, wages, and innovation in the long run. Have they attained their size due to the exercise of market power? They become better at creating barriers to entry for rivals growing. So although I showed you the correlation with patenting as a measure of innovation, but maybe these patents are being used to block the fusion of innovation with creating patent thickets. Maybe there's lobbying to change the rules of the game, and then finding the stuff on labour markets. So I hope it's positive. But yeah.
I just want to clarify, this correlation was at the industry level, not the individual firm.
Yeah, that's at the industry level.
So you could have this big with nothing very much, but a lot of small firms doing innovation.
You could do. I mean, to be honest, you also see that. As I showed you, you see that correlation. Yeah, but it's at the industry level. So if you were killing off, the industry is attractive because if you're killing off the innovations of the other firms, then you would expect to capture that at some level. I mean, of course, the industry is crude, but okay. So let me. I knew I had too many slides. But the last 5 minutes, let me just quickly give you a way of putting this together in terms of thinking about markets and labour markets. So we have a little model in our paper, David, and ongoing work and extended it. So firms of heterogeneous productivity, they have some product market power. They face downward slope and residual demand curves. We didn't have any labour market power in our original paper, so we'll kind of add some labour market power. So they face upward sloping labour supply curves. So wage posting monopsony, as in the new kind of literature, building on some of these many papers on the monopsony side of things. So, way to think about this, not many equations, I promise you no equations, some equations. There's the labour share, wage bill divided by value added. And in this model, it's very, you can express this as the ratio of three different parameters. So first of all, technology. So if it's Cobb-Douglas production function with labour shares equal to the output, that's the speed of labour. A markup, which we had in the original paper, so bigger price cost margins, lower labour shares, I mentioned that. But then we also have the markdown, so the higher, more the market power of the labour market, that will also tend to depress the labour share value added. So you have all those three different elasticities. And if you think about a change in the labour share, it's going to depend on technology, product market power, and labour market power. Now, when you think about the aggregate, you have to aggregate this across the size of firms. So this is the relative size of the firm. And it's important because market share of the firm means that, I mentioned a couple of times, even if these didn't change, just by reallocating more output to low labour share firms, you're going to create a downward pressure on the labour share, even in the absence of those type of changes. So if the environment's changed, the favourite superstars who generate high markups, this can still depress the labour share. It implies the increase of the size weighted markups, for example, here's labour share in the US, as we know, went down a lot, especially since the early 80s and early 2000s. Here's 4 other countries, so it's not just the US, these are the previous countries in the world. Labour share has also fallen there. Here's the UK. Labour share hasn't fallen as much in the UK as it has in those other countries, but you can see it has drifted downwards over time. We have an application of that framework now for the UK. So this is just rewriting the latest paper. So I'm going to just give you a little thing here, and ask how much of the change in the labour share could be explained by increases of size weighted markups in the UK. So let's keep technology the same, keep LSE the same, and just work off the change of the markups, which we've got up in the UK, like other countries. So size weighted markups in the UK have gone up by about 0.4% a year, which implies the labour share fall of about 7 percentage points. The actual fall of the labour share in the UK is only about 3.5 percentage points. So we actually over-explain what's happened in the UK by the increase of product market power. And if you compare that to the US, although qualitatively things are similar in the US, we only explain about half of the fall in labour share in the US by the markup. So it's an interesting difference. It seems to be different things might be happening in the US versus the UK. So what could be happening? So one story is that technology is different. So maybe technological change is biased towards labour. Seems pretty unlikely. All the stories, that's Mogler, Group, everything else is that if anything, the robots are biased against labour. Maybe Clive will disagree. I think you found labour share is unchanged by robots, right? Yeah, so 0. So I only go with 0. But so I don't think that can explain why the UK labour share seems to have held up. I think the more obvious story is that it's to do with the national minimum wage. So this is what's happened to the minimum wage over time. Massive increase since 1999. UK now is one of the toughest national minimum wages in the world. That can lean against the kind of monopsony. There's some evidence that Steve and Mirko and I have done earlier work, the increase of the minimum wage. So I think that we talk a bit about why the increase of superstar firms doesn't necessarily cause an increase in monopsony. There's lots of reasons why that might be the case. I think that the most obvious story in the UK is that the minimum wage lends against these other forces, which in the US will push down the labour share. I think I'm out of time, so I think I have an assessment. I argue against the idea that because we've seen these general things of increased dispersion, falling labour shares, rising markups happening in Europe, where competition policy has been made tough. I don't think institutional factors are the main thing that explain what's going on. I think it's more fundamental technological reasons. But I do think that we do have to worry about how we have antitrust policy in the second world. So I do think there's arguments of modernising competition policy. And we have lots of ideas of how to do that, changing standards of proof, improving interoperability, better access to regulation. Much of this is actually happening right now, actually, most strongly in the EU and somewhat in the UK, and unfortunately it's already in the US. So I do think there is a need to modernise antitrust policy. And I actually do think labour market policy is important. I think, again, this is speculation, it's ongoing work with some people in this room. I do think things like minimum wages are important in leaning against these forces pushing down the labour share. I think the UK might be resolved, well, that's been successful. I think that's think about what should be happening in the US. in terms of labour standards and other kinds of institutions to lean against some of these forces of pushing down the labour share and pushing labour. I think those are important. Anyway, so I hope I've convinced you, at least shifted your priors, that thinking about thermos and pulsars, certainly important in the cross-section, and interestingly also in the time series, with widening differences between superstar firms and the rest. I think it helps us understand some of the trend that's happening in the labour market. I think it's probably driven more by technology, but that still plays an important role for competition. And it's a very rich research area, so hopefully do a bit more of it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.